So, please do be encouraged to turn on your videos if you don't mind, if you don't object, because I'd like to start by asking you if did anybody listen to the Mahler in advance of today's conversation? Or do you have any familiarity with the Mahler? That's great, wonderful.
Yeah, actually, we did listen to it.
Oh, good.
I was doing something else the last half, but it was going. It surprised me. The last half was kind of different than the first half.
Yeah, we're going to talk about exactly that. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's an astute observation, David.
I thought I knew Mahler, and I didn't realize how militaristic a lot of that stuff was when I actually listened to it. So that I wouldn't be stupid when we talk today.
Yeah, that's just it. And we'll talk about that too. There are sounds of specific military bands that kind of wander in and out of the symphony.
Yeah.
So, yes, please.
I remember the performance a few years ago, and how you promised that was the first part of the story, and then you'd get around to the part two, the Resurrection Symphony, and I couldn't believe my ears, but I'm glad it really happened.
Yeah, me too. Oh, thanks, John. I appreciate that. Yes, please. That's Peggy. To go ahead and unmute yourself and tell me your impressions.
First of all, I did listen to the recording that was suggested.
Great.
And of course, that is such a magnificent piece of music that I thought I'm in awe that you would choose it for the Norwalk Symphony.
Oh. Yeah, well, we performed it. Oh my God, 6-7 years ago or something, and it was I loved doing it with Norwalk. We did Mahler 2 as well, and slowly, but at this pace, we'll get to Mahler 9 in 50 years.
Very good.
But yeah, we've done. I love Mahler 1. I love Mahler 2. I love the big symphonies. But was there anything specific, Peggy, about the work that affects you, just out of curiosity?
Oh, well, it's Mahler.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't.
That is absolutely true. And he does. He has really, he is his own entity very much. There is no one else like Mahler. You will never confuse anybody else for Mahler. Mahler is Mahler. And we're going to talk, specifically about what makes Mahler and the challenge of being Mahler for Mahler too.
I'll shut my mouth and listen.
No, that's great, Peggy. Vale, you want to?
Hi, Jonathan. Hi. Hey, I just was watching your buddy Bernstein conducting the Mahler piece. Okay, as you know, how he did a magnificent job, to say the least, the Vienna Symphony. Okay, but Mahler does amaze me how some of it sounds still so fresh, some of it, and it comes at you really fast in spots, and it's a huge contrast in a short amount of time. And maybe the audience in that day was a little confused. I can see where there's dilemmas with this, what they're used to and what they're getting. And for him, I love this phrase. He wasn't making mistakes creating it over 14 years. He was experimenting.
Right.
And it works out, but it is quite a piece, I must say.
Yeah, it's something. And it's a perceptive perceptive thought, Vale, too, about how there's so much. We're going to talk specifically about how there is just so much material in it. Yeah, there's so much going on, and so many disparate elements.
Yeah, exactly.
That's very much his compositional philosophy. So that's great. Thanks. Anybody else want to add anything? Sandra, is there something you wanted to say or no? I remember you raised your hand because you listened to the symphony.
Right, that's right. So yeah, no, take it away. I'm gonna learn.
Okay, great. So so those of you who were here for my last discussion, we talked about Brahms' First Symphony, right? And what those of you would remember maybe about that piece is it had a notorious long and challenging birthing process, right? Over 20 years. So as Vale was just referring to, if Mahler's First Symphony wasn't quite that extended, it was nearly as struggle filled. It had its first premiere in 1889, which did not go well, particularly in its reception. And all the subsequent premieres over the subsequent nearly decade, he keeps messing with it and how it's presented. None of these premieres, as I said, are received well until Prague in 1898. It loses a movement during that period of time. Blumina, which is beautiful, and sometimes performed separately, but he takes it out, much to the benefit of the architecture, I would say. He, excuse me, he includes a program for the audience at one point to describe it. Then he takes the program out. The people who get the program complain that they have the program, that it's too much information. The people who don't complain that they don't understand it. Alma Mahler, his famous not yet wife at that point, does not like it when she hears it for the first time. So part of this, what's going on is Mahler was reputed to say, Beethoven had the good fortune to be able to write something still out of the world of Mozart and Beethoven, his first symphonies, whereas Mahler had the bad luck of having to be Mahler from the very beginning. So let's kind of dive into who Mahler is. He has this very famous conversation with the composer Sibelius, and he says in that, the symphony must be like the world. It must embrace everything. And this symphony really does. More than just being the world, it's like life. He pulls from so many different experiences and so many different materials. And as we talked about already, sometimes they are pushed really jarringly against each other. And that's part of why people at the time had such a rough go of this piece. A lot of it, and why people's reaction early on was mixed negative, also has to do specifically with the third movement, which we will get into when we get to it. Okay, so I'm not going to give a huge amount of background tonight. First, I want to just dive in, and then we're going to kind of let Mahler reveal himself through the symphony. So we're going to listen to the beginning together, and then we'll have maybe the opportunity to have some reactions. Here we go. I'm actually going to even pause it right there for a moment. So, anybody want to comment about what you've already heard? You are welcome to do so right now if you would like.
Jonathan, I just feel it's nature waking up. Just, and actually, I almost think of him being out there listening and then turning it to music, and it just has that natural, if you want to call it that, sound, which probably confused the audience a bit.
Yeah, it's
with the long, slow, and like, wait, aren't we? What is this? So yeah.
It's all very, again, very astute fails. So let me break it. It's actually called the first instruction in the work is called Wie ein Naturlaut, or like nature sounds. And that very first sound that you hear in the orchestra, all those, it's 7 octaves of the same pitch A, played with string harmonics, which means that people are just barely touching their strings, and so it causes this overtone series, all on the pitch A. And to me, it almost sounds like there's like light refracting off the sound, and then you get maybe the sound of sort of a slow cuckoo, right? This falling forth, and it returns again, and then it becomes a chain of fourths, and then suddenly takes off for a moment, right? And so we're going to get back to that in a second, but first questions first, before we even do that. Does this opening remind anybody of any other symphonies by chance?
Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony.
Yeah, in part.
Okay.
I would say that's not inaccurate. I was going for a different Beethoven symphony.
Oh, okay.
Well, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's listen to the opening of Beethoven 9, everyone. Hear it, everybody? So here's what they have in common. Let's talk about what they have in common and what they don't. First of all, Mahler has two musical gods. Oh, I just lost my quote on it. He said, and I quote, "Now I stick to Beethoven. There are only he and Richard, and after them, nobody," by which he means only Beethoven and Wagner and nobody else. So this is obvious that once you hear them next to each other, it's definitely, let's say, a kind of a loving homage to the opening of Beethoven 9, and it's going to go deeper than that. What they have in common is that sense of wonderment, right? Like and not knowing where we are. So the Mahler begins with all those open octaves. The Beethoven begins with a closed fifth, but we still don't know where we are. And then you have these falling intervals, right? Same interval. That you remember we just heard the oboes go? It's exactly the same as the Beethoven. So that said, there are also some very key differences, right? Beethoven is often a man on a mission, and he is very much on a mission in Beethoven 9. Even in a work like Beethoven 9, which is epic, right? There is, generally speaking, a sense of like, he's a-going somewhere. Like within the, 30, 40 seconds that we just listened to, you get here. I say, like we know exactly where we are, and there's that pulsating sense of rhythm. We know what's going on pretty quickly in the Beethoven. And there's a sense of, again, as I said, mission. As Vail pointed out, with the Mahler, time stands still, right? It's as if we're sitting and observing. So let's now listen to his other musical god, Wagner. This is the opening of Parsifal. That'll do. Do you hear how, in effect, the opening of Mahler 1 is actually a cross between those two, right? Because you have that just pure orchestral color of the Wagner, and using the same technique too. I don't know if you could tell the fiddles like up using harmonics all the way in the stratosphere, and just these slowly shifting colors orchestrally. Wagner really redefines how time takes place over music, and Mahler eats that up among many of the other things that he eats up in Wagner. So now let's go back to the Mahler for a moment and sort of listen for a moment to how it develops. There's the falling fourths again. Now, David was talking about the military. Cuckoos. Falling fourths again. The more obvious cuckoos. Alpine horns. Military sound. So we can stop again. We heard the military fanfare, right? We heard the cuckoos. We heard the Alpine horns. What we begin to realize is that Mahler is actually painting a picture of his musical youth and his own musical journey. He grew up in Iglau, a provincial town in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but with a relatively important military garrison because of its proximity to Prussia. And there would have always been military bands playing. And Mahler grew up in a tavern right off the square where those military bands would often march. And so now we're getting to the heart of what makes this piece revolutionary, what makes this piece Mahler. The idea of putting these disparate elements right up against each other, sounds of nature, military fanfares, and it's going to get so much wilder as we go on. This idea is music, as I said, that embraces absolutely everything. Furthermore, for the first time, and even Vail was beginning to allude to this too, it's not music so much as an abstraction, but like music as life, right? You can imagine somebody sitting and listening to all this happening. Furthermore, Mahler has that exact experience when he's a kid. So I'm going to actually read to you this story from his youth. So his father accompanies him into the forest, realizes that he's left something at home, and so tells Mahler to stay right where he is. Then basically he forgets him there and leaves him there for hours. And when he finally comes back, Mahler is still just sitting there, listening. That's the experience we get at the beginning. Now, during these opening four movements, another significant difference between Beethoven 9 and Mahler 1 arises. Are we in D minor or are we in D major? Beethoven 9 made it very clear. Remember this? That's D minor, no questions. Let's listen to where we go with Mahler. There's those falling fourths. Falling fourths. We get it too. Well, at this moment, you know, I often divide composers up into architects and melodists. Mahler does not fit that mold because he actually writes great tunes and he's a great architect. Did you just hear all of this has been just a bunch of falling fourths, right? You know, the way that Beethoven 5 makes an entire symphony out of, we're getting the same kind of principle where we just have fourths falling and suddenly they've made themselves into a tune. Where is that tune from? I told you how the symphony Mahler just embraces from everything, his own life, other people's lives. In this case, it is in fact from his own life. This is from Songs of a Wayfarer. So let's just listen to that for 1 second.
Heut Morgen übers Feld, kau noch auf den Gräsern hin, sprach zu mir der lustige Fink, ei du Geld. Guten Morgen, ei Geld, du wird nicht eine schöne Welt, schöne Welt. Sing, sing, schön und still, wie mir doch die Welt gefällt.
Not that too. It's symphonious collage almost, right? He's just pulling from everywhere. And you saw the text, right? This is all about the birds chirping and this waltz through the forest. Just delightful. But my question is, are we in D minor or are we in D major? D major, right? Like very, this feels good, right? All happy, none of this misery of Beethoven 9. So that is actually a little problematic because works that are going to fall into a heroic narrative, which, spoiler alert, this is, are supposed to go from the minor in their first movement to the major in their last movement. That's how Beethoven 9 works. Gets to. Famously, that's how Beethoven 5 works. Gets to. Not to mention Brahms 1, which we talked about last week, right? Or a month ago now. Gets to. So what is Mahler up to? Because the thing is, this is going to be a heroic narrative. In fact, the title of the work is Titan, which he borrows from a heroic epic by Jean-Paul. I'm not sure actually how to pronounce it because he's German, and I always want to say it with a French accent. He is complicating things because it's a complicated work, right? So he is complicating the narrative. What he is doing and what he's going to do is he's basically going to put the pressure of that narrative from tragedy to triumph all on the fourth movement. I think David noted too, like how different the second half of the symphony is from the first half. What he's done is he's taken that entire, all that angst and shoved it into the fourth movement. This is in fact continuing a trend. Beethoven has already been putting more weight on the fourth movement because pre-Beethoven, Mozart symphonies' fourth movements are actually rather light affairs. Once you get to Beethoven 5, you know, when you have this motion from the tragedy to triumph, the fourth movement's really important, right? Because now you're telling a story and you want a resolution at the end. And that's what makes the symphony have more weight. Mahler is saying, I'm going to give it more weight still. I'm going to put all the kind of specifically heavy business all in the fourth movement. We'll get to that later. So the first movement, on the other hand, is actually more or less pretty uplifting, right? It's basically jubilant. He describes it as we are carried away by a Dionysian jubilant mood that has not yet been broken or dulled by anything. So that's largely true. I want to show you the exception. Here we go. Maybe storm cloud. So that's what we call foreshadowing. Don't forget what you just heard. Put it away in the back of your head for a moment. We'll get back to it in the fourth movement. For now, we're skipping to the second. That's the beginning of the second movement. Anybody want to observe anything about that? What do you hear? How does it make you feel? Anything?
Maybe stretching, but a peasant dance of some kind.
Yeah, I think
I was
so.
gonna- I was going to say dancing as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that probably of all the movements, this would be the most accessible for his audience at the time. Like, it's very clearly a country dance. It's a little bumptious, but like, you know, it's hard not to enjoy that. His original title for it was Mit vollen Segeln, under full sail, which you can hear too, right? Which the wind breaking on the waves, but mostly it's a raucous country dance. It's something like a cross between a waltz and a Ländler, I would say. For those of you who do not know what a Ländler is, since we just lost Christopher Plummer, I thought it would be worthwhile to share a really great Ländler with you. Hold on. But do you hear there's actually something quite in common about the two? Do you hear this? You know how the second movement of Mahler 2 begins? Or sorry, the second movement of Mahler 1 rather? That's a Ländler. It's a country dance. So just quickly, because as much as I love this movement, it's kind of the least controversial, I would say. Let's stop at the middle section. Because in the middle section, what you're going to hear is like Mahler playing heavily into sensuality, which is something that he is definitely very good at. All the sliding string. Sliding string. Pretty decadent, right? You really get the full feeling of the decadence of Fin de siècle Vienna. Just as a side note, why I love bringing Bernstein to conduct Mahler, into these conversations. Mahler, of course, had disappeared from Vienna, from any concert in Vienna, because of World War II, and actually even leading up to World War II, because the rampant anti-Semitism in Vienna. Bernstein really felt it was one of his important personal missions was to bring Mahler back to Vienna, where it belonged, particularly as a Jewish man. And he got pushback too. Like early on, you overheard members of the Vienna Philharmonic saying things like Scheiße Musik, shit music, literally. Now, of course, again, it's played by the Vienna Philharmonic all the time. We associate it with Vienna, but there is that ugly history where Mahler actually he had to resign his post as as director of the opera there specifically because of the anti-Semitism in Vienna. So I love having Lenny with Vienna and Mahler. Now, let's get into the third movement. And I'm going to ask you to respond to this opening and tell me what you think is going on and to tell me, yeah, if you think it belongs in a symphony exactly. Okay, here we go.
Lee thinks it's a funeral march, which doesn't belong in a symphony.
Well,
and there's solo instruments.
Yeah, but what's
my paraphrasing?
Right. Yeah, it's great. What's the tune?
It's Frere Jacques, right?
Yeah, it's Frere Jacques in the Mahler.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Frere Jacques as a funeral march.
A march.
So it's very astute observation by everybody involved, including Lee, of course. There is a famous example of a funeral march in a symphony, which I want to play for you for a second. And I assure you, Mahler was thinking about it when he wrote this. Beethoven Eroica has a very famous funeral march, but it's very much the opposite, right? It's very elevated. Like a real funeral march, not Frere Jacques in the minor. Like, what exactly is going on here? This is the movement, by the way, where apparently in the Budapest premiere, the women who were knitting in the background or sitting in God knows what box, dropped their knitting needles during this movement, both because of what has already happened and what's going to happen. So let's break down what's going on. First of all, he actually does have a direct inspiration for this. And so let me share it for you. It's pretty hysterical. Did that pop up on everyone's screen? So this woodcut was the inspiration for this movement. I don't know if you can tell what's going on. Oh, good for you, Vale. Yeah. It is a bunch of animals who have caught a hunter in the forest and who are dragging him on his funeral pyre. It's pretty morbid. I mean, or morbid isn't the right, like dark, right? Or a dark sense of humor. This kind of very ironic funeral march going on. Again, not what we think of in the symphony. So what is he doing? Like, in addition to the strangeness of the inspiration, I mean, I think we have to think about why else people were offended when they heard it. This idea of a children's tune turned into a funeral march. We have to look at his childhood too. Mahler was one of 14 children, only 8 of whom survived into adulthood. So this confronting people, this is what people lived with, right? Was this heavy, heavy rates of child mortality. But confronting people with this combination of a nursery rhyme and death together, people weren't into it. They really weren't. I mean, now it's kind of delightful, So, but at the time, raw. So now let's go back and hear what happens next in this movement. So what's going on there, my friends? What do you hear?
Sounds like a dance hall.
Yeah, it does sound like a dance hall. Hear any specific kinds of music?
Well, there's a klezmer.
Yeah, right? Definite klezmer influences. He's continuing to paint his childhood, right? As I mentioned early on, he's born above a Bavarian bar hall, basically, a Bavarian tavern. And all kinds of bands came in, klezmer, bohemian. And so now he's painting life for us. And basically now the little funeral procession that's going through the woods crosses paths with these bands. And again, people at the time were like, what in the world are you doing? This is so inappropriate. More knitting needles fall, right? Yeah.
Can I add something, Jonathan? What's very interesting, the etching of the funeral of the animals, it's humor, sarcasm, and what he might be doing in the spoofing of this is a violation of a cliche. And a cliche is the hunter always takes home the dead animal, but now, okay, so he's broken that, and he's breaking rules with the audience, and they don't like that. No, but it is a form of sarcasm or humor that violates the cliche. Okay,
that's exactly. I couldn't agree more, and that's just it. We start getting with Mahler, and we'll talk about this more in literally just a second. It's like this heavy use of irony in music, right? Heavy use of irony in music. That's not a romantic ideal. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is very far apart from all those Enlightenment ideals of universal brotherhood and all those other elevated thoughts. No, this is ironic. It's sarcastic. It's a little nasty even, right? So in order to kind of get into why Mahler would do something, maybe we would need to, talk to a psychoanalyst. Fortunately, we have a very capable one. His name is Sigmund Freud. Mahler turned to Freud when his marriage was falling apart, when Alma was having the affair with Werfel. And so let's read what Freud gleaned from their 4-hour analysis session. This is Freud, rather, talking about Mahler. Mahler's father treated his wife very badly, and when Mahler was still a small boy, an especially embarrassing scene had taken place between them. It became unbearable for the little one, and he ran away from home. But just at that moment, the well-known Viennese song, Ach du lieber Augustin, rang out from a hurdy-gurdy, like an accordion, right? Mahler thought that from this moment on, deep tragedy and superficial entertainment were tied together indissolubly in this soul, and that one mood was inevitably tied to the other. So this is very modern, right? Like, and like kind of exhibitionist almost. This music is about Mahler in a way that's really new. Like every great composer's musical, of course, is about personal utterances, but we're looking not into sort of his soul so much, but into his psyche and the damages of his psyche, right? And this is why I think for a lot of us, Mahler's music feels so modern, is because it seems relevant to us. This is we're the descendants of Freud, right? Like we're very comfortable talking about our neuroses, about what's going on in our psyche, and so is Mahler. And so that's why for a lot of people, the music still resonates and feels relevant in a way that music that precedes Mahler doesn't necessarily. Of course, with Mahler, it's elevated, it's great art, but this also gets at the heart of this kind of weird place that Mahler occupies music historically, where he has one foot very much in romanticism, right? Like all of this is coming out of Beethoven. He feels he's continuing the legacy of Beethoven, and one foot very much in the world of expressionism, which we're getting into, right? Where you just, again, you put your psyche out on display. Like if you look quickly, I'm not embarrass myself too much, hopefully, by doing an art historical comparison. Like, I think I brought this into the Alma Mahler lecture. If you look at this work by Caspar David Friedrich, like this is real romanticism, right? The wanderer in nature, and it's literally kind of the beginning of the symphony, right? That's literally the picture that we get, only with more jarring dissonances that are more modern, right? The military bands waltzing through in the sense of not knowing what key we're in. Now, with these odd juxtapositions and this look into Mahler's psyche, we're getting more into the world of expressionism, more into stuff like this. Like, we're getting more the portrait of an artist and all of the attendant strangenesses and weird dark places. And Mahler kind of exists between these two worlds. As he ages, he gets, we see more of the kind of inner Sheila, right? By the time we get to the 10th Symphony, which we talked about in my alma Mahler lecture that I did for the Youth Symphony, like he's just all of it, all the ugly places are out there. But this is such an important part of Viennese music of the turn of the 20th century, is this just, again, the psychological element. It's so important. Anyway, okay. Now, we still have to get to the fourth movement. So let's do that right now. So everyone, anybody, what does that conjure up for you? How does it make you feel? What do you think is going on?
I mean, it almost sounds like going to battle. Just they're whipped up almost John Williams-esque in some ways.
Well, John Williams sure borrows a lot from everyone.
Yes, he does.
So, yeah. Anybody else? Anything? Any other imagery come to mind for anybody? Don't have to. I would say a storm as well, right? Like the brewing of a storm too. So let's read what Mahler had to say about it. The last movement, which follows the preceding one without a break, begins with a horrible outcry. Our hero is completely abandoned, engaged in a most dreadful battle with all the sorrow of the world. Time and again, he and the victorious motif with him, is dealt a blow by fate wherever he rises above it and seems to get hold of it, and only in death, when he has become victorious over himself, does he gain victory. Now, I don't want to get too deep into Mahler's personal spirituality, which is hinted in because it's very eclectic, just like the music. But we are definitely on a spiritual quest, right? Now, we have a problem. All those symphonies I mentioned at the beginning, Beethoven 5, Beethoven 9, Tchaikovsky 4, Tchaikovsky 5, Brahms 1, all these ones that go from the tragedy to the triumph, right? Which we are now kind of doing compressed in one movement. They start in the right key. They start in the home key. Beethoven 5 starts in C, the last movement starts in C because we're in C. So does Brahms 1. So does Beethoven 9, right? We're in the wrong key. We're in F minor. We're supposed to be in D. We're trying to get here to D major. So what is going on with that? You hear how odd that juxtaposition is, right? Well, by beginning in the wrong key, we feel that much more ill at ease, right? That wild tempest that surrounds us is even more dangerous, even more spiritually perilous. The original title from his Hamburg concert was Dall'inferno al Paradiso, literally from hell to heaven. And because it's Mahler, you better believe that there are going to be more references to other music, and that in this case are going to refer to specifically spiritual elements. So here, let's move on. As Vale alluded to, like we're in a battle, lots of battle, lots of battle, lots of battle. Things start to look a little bit better. Let's go to that. It's the tune. A little hopeful, right? Here's the thing. In that version, now sounds an awful lot like Parsifal. Let's listen to Parsifal for a second. This is the Holy Grail theme from Parsifal. Right, you just heard. Parsifal, and this specific motif is all about the search for the Holy Grail, which gives you a sense of, like, again, this elevated spiritual nature of this quest that he's on. Now, still, we have a problem, right? Now we're in C major. We are which is still linked more to F minor than to where we want to go. So how are we going to get there? Let's watch what he does. So could you tell what he did? Does anybody have a sense of what he did? It's a little bit musicological, music theory stuff. He just changed keys. So normally, you have to like transition from key to key to key. He literally did this. That's all right. do that. That breaks all the rules, right? You got to somehow lead into it. And he loved this moment. I think this is Mahler's favorite moment from the symphony. And he, in fact, even said that if I'm going to be remembered for one moment in the entire symphony, it's going to be this. Let's listen to it again so you can really hear it. It gives you this sense of incredible uplift. Here we go. Major. Major. E major. Now, do you remember the falling fourths from the first movement? That sound familiar? Now, doesn't it sound great in the major instead? Here we go. Now, this would be good enough for most composers, right? He's made it to D major. We've gotten there. He could be done. Minor. You get thrust right back into it. So here's what he says. Hold on. He writes Richard Strauss about this moment. Hold on, let me just pull it up. And this is what he has to say about it. My intention was to represent a battle in which victory is always farthest away at the exact moment when the warrior believes himself to be closest to it. This is the character of every spiritual battle, since it is not so easy to become or to be a hero. So he sends you back through recollections of his youth, then straight back into the inferno of battle. Finally, when you make it back to the victory chorale, it is really exultant. And the horns even stand in triumph. And yeah, it's a moment of sheer rapture. But the incredible thing about it is that's not really even the end of the story. Because for Mahler, the first and the second symphony are directly linked. And actually all four of his earliest symphonies are linked in terms of their philosophy, content, and structure, in which Mahler called a unified tetralogy. But for him, the link between the first and the second was particularly close. I don't know if you remember from that quote I was reading earlier, how he said that only through death can the hero status be totally attained, right? So in the second symphony, Mahler sees himself, because he's abandoned the idea of the generic hero. It's all about him, of course. We knew it all along. We see him laid out in state, just for a couple seconds. Let's listen to the beginning of the second symphony. Now, don't you want to go listen to the Second Symphony? Yeah, that was maybe that was my my secret agenda all along, just to get you to listen to the second. So, in conclusion, we'll end there and then take some questions. What you get with Mahler, right, is this sense of, again, like the very late romantic, right, with these very epics, this not only everything on an epic scale, but also like an epic narrative to the symphony, right? It's like this idea the hero goes through this and goes through that, which is like very high romantic period stuff, with at the same time these incredibly modern sounds, you know, and that's what, to me, what makes Mahler Mahler, is that combination of like that late romantic ethos of just epic, you know, of just epic loves, epic battles, with also like something really deep and penetrating and often very dark. I don't know, I think that's why those of us who love Mahler love him so much. So I'm going to stop talking now and ask if anybody has any final thoughts they want to add, any questions. We can always send a link to the Second Symphony to anybody who was here tonight, so you can continue your Mahlerian journey.
I've got something. You're talking about the awakening of the psyche that Freud got into, and he's expressing it musically, and it's much more out there than people have been exposed to in their time period. For example, someone said living with Mahler is like living in a rocking rowboat. He goes back and forth. And with Alma, he told her, I want to be the only composer in the family. And Freud told Mahler, you've suppressed her composing skills, and that's why she's angry. It may have been more than that, but it is a emergence for the first time for a lot of people of really getting your feelings out in some ways.
Yeah, and it's more, it's that difference between, right, you know, like all composers, again, like express often their emotions, what's going on in their life, it comes out in their music. Like that's standard fare, but it goes to a different spot with Mahler. It's a little exhibitionist almost. He's willing to put the dark things on paper. And in the 10th Symphony, where, you know, the last thing he ever composed, you know, he's just scrawling all of his feelings about Alma onto the score, literally, like writing, you know, to live or to die for you, Almschi, and all that stuff. And it makes Mahler who he is, and it makes him so unique, because the thing is, that's then after that, people continue further in that direction, right? Schoenberg, Webern, Berg, but it doesn't, with Mahler, you still get the combination of this high romantic, you know, kind of glory that you will not get in the, you know, the later works of Schoenberg and Berg and Webern. And I don't know, it's what makes Mahler so special. Such a unique
question. Do you think that the Norwalk Symphony the audience would be ready for Das Lied wurde Erde?
I am ready to conduct it for them. It's a very challenging work. Not least of because you need a tenor who can project through steel, because the orchestration is so heavy. But yeah, I would love to do Das Lied von der Erde. I saw a beautiful version years ago with the Met Orchestra and on Sophie von Otter and what's his name? British tenor, I forgot. But yeah, I love that piece.
A couple of things. I never sensed the Parsifal connection before, but you've given me something to think about. So thank you for that.
Welcome.
Also, I understand why the academics of the day were, you know, concerned about the key relationships and uncertainty of all. But I wonder in a way why or if the common people were upset for similar reasons. I mean, I love this music from when I first heard it at a fairly early age and without much musical education. But of course, I've been conditioned by 100 years of music, dramatic music, music in films and so on. So, but was the general audience as baffled as the academics?
So the general audience, the key relationships are not what bothered the general audience. They didn't care that it started in the wrong key and ended in the right key. That gave Mahler the opportunity to do what he does, right? And shock and awe. The general audience, they were just baffled of all the. First of all, you just have this massive work where things are up against each other very jarringly, right? It doesn't go along with a sort of typical Beethovenian Brahmsian narrative. And again, the third movement in particular, now it seems so harmless to hear Frere Jacques in the minor, but at the time, it's like it was totally out there to put something like that into a symphony. And so that's why he would give the program, he would take the program back when people, were wondering what the heck was going on. It's just, you hear it now and it's sort of charming, but at the time, and I mean, it's still, I take that back. It's still very modern, very, very modern. But at the time it was really weird, dark, twisted. A little bit. Anybody else? Any questions or anything else anything you want to add about your experience of the work?
Yeah, you had a couple of questions earlier today that you.
Yeah. Do you have them in front of you, or I could?
I do.
Okay.
So the first one was after reading about Mahler's life and knowing he converted to Catholicism to be able to conduct opera, which is interesting to me because I didn't know if that was a real thing or not. So that's something else I have to ask later. I find he was aware of the threat of anti-Semitism throughout his life. He seems to be driven to prove himself and is always on guard against criticism, let alone having an eventual strained marriage to Alma Schindler. How much did this affect his behavior when his music was performed or when he conducted an orchestra?
Yeah, very much. I mean, it not only did it affect his behavior, it affected his life so dramatically, right? Yeah. I mean, they leave Vienna.
Yeah.
They leave Vienna for the States because of all the anti-Semitism. He goes and becomes the music director of the New York Philharmonic, and he ends up dying in Vienna, or near Vienna I think on the way back to Vienna. I think he dies on the train.
Horrible blood disease.
Pardon?
He had a horrible blood disease.
Yeah, well, right, and no, that's exactly right, and those are the famous 3 hammer blows in the Sixth Symphony. Right, it's the death of his daughter, the affair that Alma has, and eventually his own death at a young age. But I mean, it's awfully gutsy of him to put the klezmer music in. It's the only symphony that has, I think, that direct of a relationship to his youth. But I mean. But I do think there was this sense of him always fighting the establishment. He was always fighting the establishment. Always. And his symphonies were, other than the Eighth, they were generally not well received. And I think there is this sense, it's so funny because Richard Strauss, was also, a very avant-garde guy and just sort of sailed by comparison. Whereas Mahler, it was just always a battle. I don't know if that answers your question, Vale.
Oh yeah, it does. If you don't mind, I have a kind of a quick example of what you're saying. In 1933, my grandfather was in Berlin. He runs into Felix Mendelssohn's grandson, Albrecht Mendelssohn, and he's just been relieved from his professorship because of anti-Semitism. And he was so upset. And then he dies in 1936. He was not a young man at the time, but they named a law school later on after him. But he thought his life was over before it was over when my grandfather talked to him, and you know why. But it just is, it penetrated so deeply with people, as you know.
Yeah, but I mean, and it's Mahler said, I am, oh God, what did he say? I am 3 ways a stranger. Let's see if I can get this right. I am a Bohemian living in Austria. I am a Jew. I'll have to look up the quote. There's a third way, like just about how much he felt like an outsider. Bohemian living in Austria, Jew, and well, I don't remember the third. He just, and I think that makes him exciting, that it's definitely, he's always fighting, and he's always willing to fight. You know what I mean? His art is so absolutely not conformist. Like there is nothing conformist about his art. And he was the same way with his conducting and his directing at the opera. I mean, he got into a lot of trouble because at the opera, he really kind of created what we think of as the modern opera house, with really like modern productions. He created the kind of the sort of sacred quality that we give it, right? Where if people would applaud in the middle, he would shush them. He wouldn't let people come in late. Like that's Mahler's doing a lot of it. Like he was, his compositions got a very mixed response during his life. But his conducting, generally speaking, and his directing got a much more positive response. Although eventually, because he was so contentious and Jewish, he was forced to resign that post as well.
One quote I read, he conducted like a lion tamer. He was so intense and known for his conducting style, which was very unusual, I guess.
Yeah.
Here's a picture of him conducting.
That's
yeah, amazing man. And he conducted quite a lot. I didn't realize.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
I mean, there's so much music.
Conducted hundreds of operas in the course of a year. He'd do one a day or something.
But I think the sanctification of the operatic stage, I mean, started with Wagner, I'm sure, but I guess Mahler extended it to the whole repertoire, right?
That's exactly right. That's a very good point, John. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, of course.
The question that I had was also given to us, and it said Mahler seemed to know that some of his music would not be appreciated in his lifetime. He even had a wish to conduct his music 50 years after his death. That said, can you give an example of work that was unpopular during his lifetime, which eventually became very popular today? I think even this symphony that we listened to today was
most of them. Yeah. I mean, the only one that was received really well, like unequivocally well, is the Eighth Symphony, which to me is it's my least. It's the one I like the least because it's a kind of anthemic, and like I don't. It is the only piece where it feels like he's actually going for people's approval a little bit. The Eighth Symphony, the Symphony of 1000.
Putting a good Catholic text at the beginning of it.
Correct. Exactly. You got it. Exactly. It's he doth protest it too much a little bit in the Eighth Symphony. And that's the only work I would say that about with Mahler. The rest of them they're just so honest. They're such
one of my earliest memory of Mahler is listening to the Kindertotenlieder on a recording while reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
Yeah,
it was a really extraordinary combination.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds remarkable. Kindertotenlieder too. It's on the poetry is about the death of children.
Yes.
It's literally what it means. Kindertotenlieder, just songs of dead children. And he wrote it before his daughter ended up dying. And Alma was never liked the fact that he wrote that piece. She felt it was a bad omen. And then when their daughter,
I don't know if it's ever performed these days.
Yeah, Kindertotenlieder gets done still. I've conducted it. I love. It's very different. It's really a chamber work by comparison to everything else for Mahler feels so even when it's intimate, it's still big. Kindertotenlieder, the whole thing is on a very, very intimate scale. it's kind of a different aesthetic almost.
But it's totally moving if you can understand the words or have a translation in front of you.
So
Children, please.
anything else? I actually have to go in a moment.
I'll just mention this. I had a chance to go to the original opera house that he conducted in before they tore it down in New York City. I was just a kid.
Oh, wow.
And they had, in its day, women won't like to hear this. They had a separate entrance for women at one point. I know, it's hard to believe. Also, the famous financier Otto Kahn had a box, but because of anti-Semitism, he hardly ever used it. He was a patron of the opera, but he, refused to use it. Kind of interesting tidbit there. And then, of course, your great buddy Bernstein says, I revived Mahler in 1960. I brought him back to life in some ways. Okay, he's always a fan, but I guess they played Mahler around the world, I'm sure, at different times.
Yeah, but I mean, again, my understanding is that before Bernstein brought it back to Vienna, it just wasn't played there. Again, they called it Scheisse Musik. Like that anti-Semitism runs deep.
Particularly in Vienna.
Correct. That is correct.
Correct.
Well, I know, Jonathan, I know we have some other commitments this evening as well. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Our next and the last one for, till we decide what we're doing over the summer and into next fall is the 27th of April. And we're doing Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. So hopefully we'll see everybody here. It's perfect timing for that. And again, go on our website and see some of the other fun things that we're working on to keep you entertained, at least virtually, in the next month or two. And I will look forward to seeing everybody in April. Stay well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great job.
Thanks. Good night.